excited about this next segment here on the H&M Trucking podcast. I have H&M driver Bryan Allen on the line. Bryan, thank you for being here today.
Yes, thank you.
And I also have dispatcher Stacy Trively on the line. Stacy, thank you so much for being here with us as well.
Hi, well, thanks for having us.
Of course. Now, we're talking about predatory towing today on the show. There is a lot of news that's been going on. I've seen lawsuits. I've seen extensive reporting on predatory towing practices happening all over the United States. And the reason we brought you two on today is because you've got a little story to tell that has to do with this garbage practice. And I'm hoping that what we can get out of this is just a few things that other drivers might be able to hear and say, hey, I can look out for that, and hopefully keep this from happening to any other drivers with any frequency at H&M. So, Bryan, I'm going to go ahead and start with you and just have you tell me the story. How did you get into the situation where you needed to call a tow truck, and what happened from there?
Sure. We didn't actually have to call a tow truck. We needed backup from the police. Let me see. This was a load that I pulled from St. Joseph, Missouri. It was going to a co-op in Indiana. It was a long shift, obviously, and at the end of a 12 or 14-hour day, I needed to find a place to stop for the night. And just on my radar, there was a Walmart supercenter. It turns out it was in a city called Lafayette, Indiana. And so I pulled in. It was a giant parking lot that could accommodate trucks, and there was actually another truck there. And I pulled close to his truck and trailer and shut it down for the night. That may have been about 9 or 10 o'clock. I think I went inside and got a couple of things from Walmart, and then I went out to my truck to go lay down. So I was completely lights out. I was probably in the middle of a dream or something, and there was a pounding on the driver's side. And somebody was pounding on it. That it very much sounded like the highway patrol or the city police. So I jumped out of the bunk and went down and opened the door, and there was a man standing there. And this is one of the weirdest things that I've seen in 15 years of trucking. There was a man standing there with a sign that said, I think the sign said something like Interstate Parking Enforcement, and it had a 10-digit phone number on it, and he was holding it up over his face. Is the thing. And I said, what do you want? And he said, you've been booted. And I said, well, and at that moment, I didn't realize where the boot was. I said, where is it? That's the reason I didn't know was because the windshield was covered up with my blinds. Mm-hmm. So he goes, you've been booted. Call the phone number. I can't answer any questions. That's how I jumped out of the truck. And that's when I seen the device that he had climbed up on the front of the truck, standing on the steer tire. And they had put this great big yellow device that covered the entire windshield. He wasn't kidding. And then he was kind of laughing or smiling or something. He said, don't you dare touch it, because it'll pop your windshield. You just call my boss and they'll get all of this straightened out. Or something. And they weren't kidding. This device that they put on it was called a barnacle, and it was bright yellow. And when you're looking at it from the inside, it looks like an abalone oyster shell or something. And it's got these. It's like a suitcase that unfolds, and they stick it to the windshield, and it's got these two giant suction cups on it with a big warning that you can see inside the vehicle, and it says, "Don't touch it, because it'll shatter the windshield." Mm-hmm. And so we called the company. I called my company. This was at 2 a.m. It's at 2 a.m. and somebody answered. The instructions was to get on the floor and get away from the windows and call the police. The Lafayette Police Department, they seemed to know what was going on. And they said something like, this happens like every single night. We'll be right out there. In the meantime, I actually turned on the motor and tried to drive off, but you can't get away from these guys. Once they get this thing on the windshield that is just blinding, that you can't get away from them, it's not safe to drive.
Sure.
you can't hardly drive 2 or 3 miles an hour. And and they of course they followed me to the other side of the parking lot. And I think it was a few minutes later the police showed up, and the police were completely useless. They said something like, "Oh, it's a civil issue. We see this every single night. You guys are just out of luck. Apparently, we can't force them to take that thing off. Indeed, if you do touch that thing, it'll crack. It'll shatter the windshield."
I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but the first thing that comes into my mind when you tell me about how these officers acted is, are they on the take? Are they getting, if you do call and pay this $1,000 fee and this guy takes the thing off your windshield, how much of that $1,000 is going into the cops' pockets to keep this racket going? And, I've got no proof of that. Obviously, it's just a thought, but
that's suspicious.
It's definitely interesting because their motto is to serve and protect. And I don't feel like you were protected or served
That's weird.
until somebody pulled out a firearm, which is way too late for them to act appropriately. And again, just sorry that this happened to you, and to make you replay it in your head. Like I said before we came on here, I know this probably isn't your favorite story to tell, but I think that we are getting a lot of lessons here for drivers that are listening on what to look for and how to handle this situation. You said that you called H&M immediately. I know that that's probably priority number one. Stacy, can you talk me through a little bit of the standard operating procedure like this? If you have another driver that is dealing with something like this, what are the exact steps that you want them to take now that you've experienced this?
I actually think that Bryan handled this like perfectly by calling in and then our on-call person having him turn around and call the police. I don't know any other way to get out of it or get away from it. He was in a dangerous situation that night. You
couldn't get away from them. And I want to point out, we didn't hardly mention this. There was another driver there. There was a dude he was either from Ukraine or from Poland or something, and he had his own independent company, and they did the same thing to him. They had two of us right there. Now, I'm not sure how he got his off. I think the police, they got the code. This device, it has a number pad on the side of it. I think somebody gave him the code. So the other driver, he left. I don't know how he got out of it, to be honest.
But somehow, I mean, maybe he paid him. You never know. They could have just called that number and given him what they wanted so that he could get on his way. And that's unfortunate, but you hear the term predatory towing practices, and some people will kind of turn an eyebrow up at that and think, well, that's a little bit heavy-handed to call it that. And I really don't think it is. I think this is absolutely predatory. The guy wouldn't be packing a gun otherwise. And it also makes me wonder, how do they get their hands on this type of equipment? I can't just go down to the hardware store and buy a boot, like a wheel boot, and go start putting it on people in the parking lot. I couldn't even do that if somebody was parked in my own driveway. So how is it?
You actually can buy those, because after this all came up, and I'd never heard of this barnacle thing. So I did a lot of Googling just to see what it was all about. And you can actually go online and buy them. I can't remember how expensive they are, but yeah, you can buy those. So it could, any Joe Blow that's got the money can go get one and make, $2,000-$3,000 a night, easy money.
That's ridiculous. That should be
ridiculous.
There should be some sort of legislation worked in around that. This seems like a law enforcement tool, and those shouldn't be readily available to the public, in my opinion.
Right. You would think they wouldn't be, but they are.
Wow.